much for coming, and I'm touched that you would spend part of your Saturday with me, so thank you. And what I'd like to talk about today is near-death experiences in relation to, I think, the biggest question of existence, and that is whether there is a life after death. And want to start with a couple of preliminary remarks. One is that the question of life after death is a serious question. I want to underline that. And very important question. But even when I first started lecturing about this in the early 70s, I always prefaced what I had to say by this, that it's a serious question, but it's not yet a scientific question. And so therefore what I would suggest to you, I mean, I'm sure there are people here who are just sort of entering out into this field. Anybody who tells you that, quote, there is scientific evidence of life after death, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. That's the fact. Life after death is a philosophical question. It's one of the big questions of philosophy, and it's still a philosophical question. And unfortunately, when this first emerged again into rational consideration back in the late 19th century, people by then knew about scientific methods, so when they said, well, let's investigate this question of life after death, they leapt to the thought that, oh, it's a scientific inquiry. It's not. It's not. And they set the field off in the wrong direction when they went that route. It's still a philosophical question. And secondly, I want to talk a little bit about doctoral degrees, of which I happen to have two. Ph.D. in philosophy, with my specialties being logic and philosophy of language and ancient Greek philosophy, as I said in my book, Life After Life. And it was my amazing experience when I first started getting doctoral degrees that people took me seriously because I had a doctoral degree. And I think that can be a big problem in this field because anybody who stands before you with some sort of degree behind their name and makes some claim about the afterlife, sadly there are a lot of people who accept what a person with a doctoral degree says, even if it has nothing to do with their... So what I would say is that anybody who makes that claim that there's an afterlife and has some sort of academic credentials that go along with it takes on a real major burden. And that is, let me put it this way. People often start inquiring into this sort of thing because of a grief. Right? What brings a lot of people to this is grief. Now, let's suppose as a person with a couple of doctoral degrees, I would stand up here and say, oh yes, there's an afterlife and so on. Well, there are a lot of grieving people in the audience who are going to take comfort from that, right? Because I have a doctoral degree. Well, let's just suppose that 6 months goes on and there was bound to be some breakdown in my methodology, so I shouldn't have made that claim. Well, that's going to leave those people who took comfort from what I said in a terrible situation. First of all, they are propelled back into their grief. Also, they have a personal problem with me because, you know, I made that statement, and so I've harmed somebody. And the reason I'm insisting on this is, in this kind of field, you've got to be very careful about thinking through these things. There's the question of the afterlife is one of the most difficult questions that you can face as a rational person. And so, it kind of upsets me that in this field there are people who run around with calling themselves doctor. Well, if you look into their credentials, for example, I was in Europe a few years ago, and this woman said she was referred to this alleged authority on the near-death experience as Dr. So-and-so, which is how this person presents themselves. But this woman said she looked into the credentials of this person, and the degree was from a diploma mill in India. And that the way you get a doctoral degree through that service is to submit a saliva sample. Right? And none of this is to be unkind, but I think that the point is, if you're interested in this, check up on somebody's credentials, right? And don't take somebody seriously about anything they say if it's not anything to do with their professional credentials. I mean, and so I have a Ph.D. in philosophy, as I said, and an M.D. degree, and I was a forensic psychiatrist. Does any of that qualify me to make a pronouncement on the afterlife with authority? And the answer is absolutely not. So you have to be careful and thinking of this whole field, because I go back to, this is a serious question. I think it's the biggest question of existence. And as of yet, we don't really have the logic or the mind to answer this question. Now, at the same time, people will get curious, well, he's talked to thousands of people with these experiences. What does he think? So to satisfy that curiosity, I will go on and say, to my utter astonishment, here in 2017, at the age of 73, if you just ask me, do I think there's an afterlife? I will stammer and say, well, yes. And I will sort of go through the process that I reached that from a person who had no exposure to religion whatsoever, except a little taste of Judaism from my dad's friends. But otherwise just raised in isolation from religion. And so the idea of an afterlife is still highly counterintuitive to me. I started life, my academic life, as an astronomer. Built my first telescope at the age of 7 or 8. And so it's still counterintuitive to me to say that there's an afterlife. It's more that opinion has been kind of extruded from me by circumstances, as I'll talk about it. But I also want to emphasize I have no interest in trying to convince anybody else of that, right? That just because I say it, who happens to be a person with a couple of doctoral degrees, doesn't mean it's true. Everybody has to go on their own personal quest on this. Sure. And that's a very important thing to do. Now, I want to divide this talk into 3 parts. One is I want to talk a little bit about my background, to tell you about, more than anything else, my limitations or the presuppositions that I bring to this kind of inquiry. Okay? And because that's very important for you to know, since there's nobody who's an authority, then you deserve to know a little bit about where the person who's coming from, who makes a claim like this. And secondly, then I'm going to do a little brief overview of some of the characteristics of near-death experiences, which probably everybody knows about now who hasn't been hiding out in a cave in the Himalayas for the last 40 years. But nonetheless, just to sort of orient us, I'll talk a little bit about the characteristics, or what it is that people tell us who come to the brink of death and are revived. And third, I'm going to talk about an entirely new method of rational investigation of this question, which I have been carrying on now for decades, and which has now made a sort of breakthrough. And what I will say, but not to dictate or to make anybody believe it, but more to raise a question for analysis, is that I think I have made a real breakthrough in the rational investigation of life after death. Again, I'm not saying scientific. A new method of rational investigation which has brought about some rather astonishing findings. And not a proof of life after death, but an entirely new methodology which enables us to approach this question in a genuine rational method which does not lapse into pseudoscience like the parapsychologist or whatever. And that is verifiable in the sense that anybody who works through this can see it for themselves. So, background. Well, my dad was a surgeon who served in World War II as a medic in the Pacific Theater. And as I have sort of figured out in retrospect, that it accounts for the fact that a lot of my early memories of him is that when I was a child was his hostility to anything religious. And this was, to me, a really wonderful thing to escape that, being from Georgia. Plus, my maternal grandmother was a humorist, and her favorite topic of humor was religion. So that's where I came in. Religion was something to me. It was just, until, like I said, when my dad started practicing in this town where there was a church on every corner, with those attitudes, you can imagine that he was kind of rejected at first. And so, obviously, in that circumstance, it was the Jewish physicians in town who reached out to him. So all my memories as a kid, anything to do with religion, was all about these great Jewish doctors. And we would talk about things like this. But in that context, it was nothing about an afterlife. It was all about how you try to be a good person here while you're here. And then ask a lot of questions, which was another one about. So, having built my first telescope at 7 or 8, I decided I would be an astronomer when I was about 8 years old. And I went to the University of Virginia at the age of 18, intent on going on to get my Ph.D. in astronomy. And it's still one of my favorite subjects, astronomy. But in high school, I'd gotten interested in philosophy, so I took a philosophy course my first semester at UVA. And the first book they handed to us was Plato's Republic. And I can show you on the page where I said, this is for me. That's what I want to be, as a philosopher. And then as I read into this book, as anybody who knows it will remember that at the end of the Republic, there's this amazing story about a warrior who was believed dead on the battlefield, but revived and told about leaving his body and going through a passageway into this other realm and so on. And the fact that Plato took that seriously was what woke me up to the afterlife question, because Plato was still my hero, right? And the fact that this man who brilliance is around us, everything we do is surrounded by Plato. It's like right over here at the university. Well, where did the university system came from? That was Plato's invention. It's that you go over to the campus and you'll see, if you walked into the campus of Plato's Academy, you would immediately recognize it as a university, because he's the one who set up the basic structure. And so then I asked my professor, Professor Hammond, about this story about this man who was allegedly dead. And he said, oh yeah, the early Greek philosophers were interested in this, and they called it anabaosis, that apparently some people who had apparently died and then told these stories. And he said there were other Greek philosophers too who were interested in this. So I was just fascinated. Then in 1965, I was a third-year student at UVA and heard about a professor on campus, Dr. George Ritchie, who some years before had been pronounced dead and revived, and took the opportunity to listen to Dr. Ritchie talk about his experience and immediately knew, number one, that this guy was for real, right? That it was obvious to me that he was completely sincere. And did that mean that his experience was real? No. But I just didn't know. But what I was impressed by was this personal presence of this wonderful man, still the finest person I ever knew, George Ritchie. Then, to make a long story short, I went on and got my Ph.D. in philosophy at the age of 24. And anybody in this audience who's in my age range can realize that there was something terribly wrong with a person who would have 2 doctoral degrees before he was 31 years of age. 3 of those years I'd been a philosophy professor, and that was true. You know, I spent my whole life with my nose in a book. But anyway, I went on and was a philosophy professor for 3 years, teaching logic and philosophy of language and Greek philosophy were my major interests. And began to hear these from my students, and also from the faculty members who knew that I was interested in this. I heard lots of stories. So to make a long story short, since 1965, I've had the great honor and privilege, as it is, of having talked with thousands of people from all over the world who came to the brink of death and had this common patterned experience. And throughout that, it's still been very counterintuitive to me about the notion of an afterlife. William James once said in one of his varieties of religious experience, he said that if you are not imbued with religious thinking when you're a kid, then it's very difficult to get that started in your later life. And that's always been the case for me. What have I learned, so to speak, about these experiences in connection with the thousands and thousands of people I've talked with who've had them? Well, and that brings us to the second part of my presentation, which is about what kind of characteristics that these experiences have. And basically, it's of the thousands that I've talked with, they are related by what we call a family resemblance. If you studied philosophy, you know about that concept. But that means that not every experience has each and every one of these characteristics, and that is that I've identified about, say, 15 or so common characteristics. And one experience may have 2 or 3 of these, or 5 or 6, or on up to the whole spectrum. And so I think that's still how it is, but some of the characteristics that we know most about are that people, for example, when they are resuscitated, one of the common things they will say to me is, they say, yeah, I heard that doctor say that I was dead. It's like, oh my God, we've lost him, or she's dead, or whatever. And a comment I've heard repeatedly throughout these decades is people say, I have never been so alive as when I heard that doctor say I was dead. Because from their point of view, they undergo a very radical departure from ordinary consciousness, and they tell us, for example, that they changed perspective on this. They say they got out of their body and went up, and from perspective typically below the ceiling of an operating room or whatever, they look down and they see the doctors and nurses and other people trying to revive them. And they realize that, it's very interesting to me. People in the West, everybody I've ever heard says, I got out of my body. And it's interesting to me that the person I first learned about all this from Plato said it very differently, and he's describing the death of Socrates, and he said, Socrates said, I withdrew from my body. Now think about what a difference of emphasis that is. I withdrew from my body. Whereas the locus of the identity wasn't in the body in the first place. The locus was outside of my body, and I withdrew from my body. And actually, even though what people tell me is that I got out of my body, when I really question it more and I think about this, is I think a more accurate statement would be I withdrew from my body. But anyway, people, however articulate they may be, and my impression is that the most common thing that people say about this experience, however articulate they may be, however many languages they may speak, they say, I just can't describe it to you. That's ineffability. That this experience is beyond our ability to put it into words. But nonetheless, they give very similar accounts. They'll tell you that they go through a passageway into some other realm of being, typically into a light far brighter than anything that we have ever experienced while we're alive, and yet nonetheless not painful to the eyes, and a light of love and comfort, and they feel almost absorbed into this love that comes from this light. And in that light, say that relatives or friends of theirs who have passed away seem to be there in some other kind of form, not in a physical presence, but people that have passed away who they knew are there to meet them. And then, most interestingly to me, I think to me this is the most interesting part of the near-death experience in a way, is people will tell you that they undergo a panoramic, holographic review of every single thing they've ever done in their lives. And that when they re-witness this event from each action of their life, when they review each action, they don't re-witness it from the point of view of the eyes they had when they were doing the action. But they review it empathically from within the consciousness of the other person with whom they interacted. It's very interesting. And people say that because our language is sequential, they have to relate this experience as though it were a sequence. But in the experiencing of it, it's not sequential. Literally everything is there at once. And they have this powerful experience of review. Then they come back in various ways. Some people say, I have no idea how I got back. There was no transition. Other people say, I was told I had to go back. Got something left to finish. Other people say that they were given a choice, that they could either go on with that experience they were having or go back to the life they had been leading. Not too surprisingly, all the ones that I've talked with chose to come back. It's very interesting that when they do, they say that it's always for somebody else, right? And it's typically for young children, most commonly. It's like, myself, I wanted to go on into that light, and I chose to come back because I had young children left to raise. This is something I hear from people all the time. Incidentally, it's very difficult to make inferences from a logical point of view about these experiences for reasons I'll get into later, but I teach my logic students. One of the things I teach in my critical thinking classes and so on is I say, always draw the minimal inference possible. Like if you've got a bunch of stuff you're trying to figure out here, you're safest if you draw the very minimal conclusion from it that you can, because then you'll be safer. It's a very good practice. And yet I would say that, and I may be wrong on this, but it's certainly my impression, I think that if you set the notion of an afterlife aside for a moment, that's not what I'm talking about now, but I think that we can draw a very startling conclusion from these life reviews without any I just don't see any way around this conclusion. And that is that, at least for many of us, life is a two-phase process. Think about it. Apparently, we lead life forward as the protagonist or the actor, and then there's a 180-degree turnaround, and we re-witness that same action from the point of view of the other characters involved. So life, for many of us, is a two-phase process. That raises the question about what the status of people who come back after this experience is. And the question that might come up is, are they in a third phase of life? And my impression is that many of them are. This was observed by Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher, who observed that the people who underwent anabosis, who were apparently dead but revived, he said they are appointed, he said, to watch over the living and the dead. That they are kind of intermediate people. And a lot of the people I've known in my life who had these profound near-death experiences, I think they fit that very well. 5 minutes to go. Oh, great, good. Okay, and then when we start talking about this, there's always the framework for debating about this kind of experience is nothing new. It goes back literally to antiquity. The same debate we're having today, you could sit with Plato and Democritus and have the same dispute. Some people say, oh yeah, I take this as evidence, there's this indicator of an afterlife. Other people tell you, no, this is just the physiology of the brain acting up. It's oxygen deprivation. Well, I have never taken that seriously for philosophical reasons, because we just don't know in reality what the connection or the relationship between the conscious mind and the body is. That's the reality. But certain people think they know, the answer to that philosophical question. So they say, well, this has got to be in the brain. I say baloney. One of my own professors of medicine in 1972 told me about her experience of trying to resuscitate her mother. And she said that as her mother died, she herself, this physician, fell out of her body, looking down at her body and her mother's deceased body, and looking around, she said, trying to get my bearings. She saw her mother there, now in spirit form, she said. Then said goodbye to her mother, drawn off into the light. Now, my professor was not in a physiologically distressed situation. There was no question of a cutoff of the oxygen flow to her brain. So it doesn't make any sense to say that this kind of experience is caused by the oxygen deprivation. In many cases, I've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that I have interviewed in my career dealing with the terminally ill and their families and so on, who have what I call shared death experiences or empathic death experiences, who have identically these same phenomena, not in a situation where their oxygen flow to the brain is compromised or even that they're sick. But it's just they happen to be there when somebody else dies who they are attached to, and they say all of these things. I got out of my body and went through the passageway with my dying mother into this light and so on. So there's something else going on. A couple of years, 3 years ago, I guess, at 73, time is going pretty fast, but I remember just about 3 years ago, I think it was, lecturing in Italy, and after my lecture, a surgeon came up to me, and you could tell he was haunted. And I don't mean in an unpleasant way, but you could tell that he had been through something that, woken him up or changed him, and so led me back to the corner of the room, and this is what he told me, that some months before, he had been doing an elective operative procedure on a fairly good man who was in overall good health. There was no question of anything untoward happening during the procedure. But in the event, the man had a cardiac arrest on the table, and the surgeon was unable to revive him. So he said he was just really beside himself and thinking, oh my God, how did this happen? And what am I going to say to the family? And in the midst of all this, he said that the operating room doors flew open and a woman came raving in who he first took to be psychotic. And you know, when you're stressed, it's hard to make out what somebody else is saying to you, right? So he said he had to focus on the face of this woman to figure out what she's yelling about. And he said he heard her say, "My husband is not dead." She said, "I was out in the waiting area, and my husband came to me and he said, 'You think he's dead, and I should come in here and tell you that he's not dead.'" And so the physician told me that he was just so flabbergasted by this. He said he went on automatic. He doesn't even remember resuming the resuscitation, but he did. He said, sure enough, after a while, the patient's heart started beating again. He was there in the recovery room when the patient regained consciousness. And the first thing the patient said to him was, "I was out of my body up there at the ceiling looking down at you, and I could tell you that I was dead. And I kept trying to tell you I'm not dead. But you wouldn't hear me. I went out into the waiting room and tried to tell my wife and got lots and lots of those where the physicians involved who participated empathically in the patient's dying experience. So, what do we make of all this? Well, I don't know. But I do have some thoughts, and so we'll take a little break now. And after a while, we'll come back, and I'll have my Amway products on the way. Just a joke. But we'll look into this question of how you make sense of it.